Yeah, so it's been a long time coming, I suppose. I've seen enough of these in the over the past years, so it's nice to finally be able to get up on stage and present some work to you all. So yeah, as Matt said today, due to the audience and the kind of like what you guys do day to day, I've kind of tried to filter this and kind of tailor it to you a little bit in using a bit of a continuum. So rehabilitation all the way through to the kind of start line for an athlete on competition day. And it's going to basically just cover the potential application of how we use ischemic preconditioning and in what circumstance it may come in handy for different practitioners and or coaches or support staff. So conflict of interest, I have no actual potential conflict of interests and I'll not be discussing any off-label topics, drugs or products otherwise. So there's three main learning objectives today. First one is just simply describe how ischemic preconditioning is performed. Secondly is to recall certain mechanisms of action that take place following ischemic preconditioning. And thirdly, assess how and when IPC may provide the greatest benefit to an athlete in whatever circumstance that may be. So let's start off. What is ischemic preconditioning? It can be described as 3 to 4 brief periods of ischemia, followed by tissue reperfusion that confers subsequent protection against a magnitude of tissue injury, usually caused by prolonged ischemia. And this is kind of a visual graphic. So nowadays we tend to place cuffs on limbs, upper or lower limbs, and you can see on the right there's a bit of a description of using 220 millimeters of mercury, which is the orange, which is tightening on the limb, causing blood flow restriction or arterial blockade, and the 5 minutes of unrestricted reperfusion, the recovery period, in pink, allowing full arterial reflow. So I'm just going to quickly discuss the seminal work of how IPC came about and how they discovered its protective effects. And it was a great paper, and they basically found that through observation only, that angina patients that were visiting hospitals that had suffered heart attacks tended to have better survival rates. And this may kind of be counterintuitive in a way, because we know that angina causes normally cardiovascular complications. But it seemed to be that the actual problem that was angina was in a way weirdly causing some protection when a more extreme insult was present in the form of a myocardial infarction. So what they did was they took canines. This was back in kind of the days where it was a lot more appropriate or acceptable to be doing this stuff. Nowadays it's a bit frowned upon. So the mechanistic insight that what we got now would probably be hard to come by. But they took a canine model and they repeatedly clamped a certain artery in canine hearts. They used 2 groups. So they used their 5-minute occlusion periods, 5-minute reperfusion, as we saw in the previous slide, and they did this 4 times, which to the author's acknowledgement, it was a bit of an arbitrary set value, but it seemed to carry on from that point. So once the intermittent clamping was done, they either occluded the artery for 40 minutes or for 3 hours. What they actually found was, after 40 minutes of sustained ischemia, the canine hearts that had received the intermittent clamping, the ischemic preconditioning, massively improved on the amount of damage that was actually caused. So they had a great reduction, probably about 75% reduction in infarct size on the tissue. However, the group that sustained the 3-hour clamp, there was no change. So that indicates to us that we can do a little bit, providing the chronic stimulus is not too much, because that 3-hour was just too much to salvage any tissue. The next paper that came in 1993 expanded on the work, and you could almost say that this opened the floodgates into how IPC is now used. And they use the same model of clamping the same coronary artery in animals, but this time what they wanted to do was chronically cause an insult on a different remote location in the heart to see whether if you clamp one area, does it offer protection in another area that is sustaining ischemia for a long period? And it was actually very similar findings. They showed significant reductions in kind of the area of tissue necrosis, especially when relating to left ventricular weight and the actual area that was at risk. So again, this opened the gateway because the authors concluded that the preconditioning effect is not actually limited to the cells or area that it's being preconditioned. So how does preconditioning occur? This is probably something that you'd see in any kind of physiological textbook, and it's just a basic chart of different ways that cells communicate or different actions of protection through transfer of humoral factors. What we're specifically probably interested in as one of the key mediators or moderators in ischemic preconditioning is paracrine signaling. And we know that there's a kind of an exosomal delivery from ischemic preconditioning, that the cells that have been undertaken through brief periods, they're transferred to other cells that haven't been touched, and this is kind of how the remote pathway begins to work. So exosomal delivery to a cell from a cell experiencing oxidative stress can enhance resistance against oxidative stress via attenuated losses in cell viability. And this is the whole concept of being able to apply a stimulus briefly somewhere and having protection somewhere else. So some recent work has nicely demonstrated this actually. This is quite a new paper out last year. And they basically found that this is a great example of exosomal delivery. So one of the microRNAs, microRNA-24, they found that this was massively increased after IPC, so brief occlusions. And they actually showed that this was directly correlated with the reduction in ischemia reperfusion injury in animals. And again, just to emphasize, all this is a practical example of this kind of cell signaling. So that's a brief introduction of where IPC started from and the actual tissue that was underway. But nowadays, 20, 30, 40 years later, we're actually looking at research and we know that it can act on other tissues. And this is just the expansion of this remote preconditioning phenomenon. So we know that it can potentially add benefit to the vasculature and even the muscle. So I'm just going to discuss both of these in more of a rehabilitative, protective aspect and see if it can apply to certain patients. So when assessing vascular function, a commonly used test is the FMD test. And all this is basically a 1-minute recording of baseline arterial function. You apply a distal cuff occlusion, which is aiming to, again, blockade of arterial inflow down the line. So if we're assessing brachial artery function, you can see at the top diagram, you'd place the cuff on the forearm, and then you'd measure post 3 minutes once the cuff is released and blood flow enters. And the whole idea of flow-mediated dilation is to assess the amount of dilation that occurs on the reperfusion, the amount of blood flow, and the amount of shear rate on the artery. And the great thing about this test is it actually provides an index of nitric oxide mediated dilation. So therefore it can be used as a measure of nitric oxide bioavailability. And we know that this molecule nitric oxide carries a lot of modulating effects on the vasculature, both protective and adaptive effects such as angiogenesis. So I've spoken about cardiac damage. I just want to show you a really nice study that was done on the vasculature protecting against endothelial injury. So same thing, when the endothelium or the vasculature is prolongedly clamped, we see reductions, as you can see on the right-hand figure, in flow-mediated dilation. However, when you apply ischemic preconditioning and then clamp the vasculature, this effect is nullified, so we actually maintain vascular function and dilation capacity. And what these authors did, which was really nice, was they actually also added to this literature by showing a bit of mechanistic insight, showing the activation of neutrophils upon ischemia reperfusion, which is one of the main kind of mechanisms that causes complications and inflammation to a site, was actually reduced after IPC versus a control. So Andreas gets a shout out. I think I've seen him here. So for you guys, when you've got a patient, depending on the injury, I imagine sometimes it can last a week to 8 weeks. And we know that the longer an athlete is out of play, the longer they're immobile, the longer they're off the field, they start to get a detraining or a deconditioning in various physiological systems that otherwise would help them perform. So I suppose in a clinical context or a patient context, what we want to do is see whether IPC is worth its salt in actually helping to maintain certain physiological functions during times of inactivity or injury. So I'll just bring up 2 studies from the group in Liverpool, John Moores here. So one of them, they looked at 3 times weekly IPC sessions for 8 weeks. And what they found was, after week 2, there's a significant increase in arterial function or flow-mediated dilation. And this is pretty much carried over all the way through the 8-week period in healthy humans. Secondly, they wanted to assess what happens over a shorter time frame, over a week of using more intensified daily IPC sessions. And again, they applied IPC to only 1 limb, but measured FMD or dilated capacity on 2 limbs. And they showed that not just the limb that was receiving IPC received benefit from baseline, but also the other limb. So this remote preconditioning effect was actually present in the artery of the brachial. So this kind of, again, just backs up some of the data we know now where we can use IPC as a bit of an exercise mimetic. And what we know, if we take this down to a bit of a mechanistic insight, is we know that shear stress is an important mediator in adaptation to the vasculature. So work from Danny Green's group, really great work. What they showed was they basically compared exercise with a shear stimulus, which represents most exercise, or they did a non-shear exercise control. And they showed a similar thing, that after 2 weeks, there's a big increase in dilatory function through FMD when shear is present. And this is carried through week 4, week 6. But as you can see, it's kind of like an inverted U here. So it seems actually that you're getting a bit of a reversibility by week 8, which seems strange at first. But when you marry up this with the actual dilatory adaptation and the arterial remodeling, we start to kind of get a picture of what happens in more athletic populations. So just simply applying shear stress repeatedly over an 8-week period can stimulate or act as an exercise mimetic, whereby we can start to at least maintain arterial function in more athletic populations or actually increase the dilatory capacity in non-athletic populations. So I think for you guys, providing that your populations haven't got vascular injuries or neurological injuries, this may be a good way to kind of cheat the system a little bit. So finally, we've touched on the cardiac, we've touched on the vasculature. I just want to actually emphasize what can actually go on the muscle. And I'm sure it's a common observation here that it's not just the either the operation or the rehabilitation process, it's often the pain that comes with it for your patients. So some interesting work has been performed in recent years. First one basically showed that preoperatively, if you apply preconditioning on a limb, you may find moderate reductions in pain. There is data to suggest otherwise, but when we look at some more mechanistic insight in a clinical setting, it's not just the actual observation of pain, it's a lot of the mediators or the biomarkers that supplement the pain response that are also blunted after preconditioning. And it was this kind of clinical work that really stimulated the first muscle damage exercise study to be performed. This group originally, they published a medical hypothesis based on this clinical literature in 2017. They were looking at the mechanism saying, well, if we can protect the muscle in periods of clinical damage, whether that is operational or injured, why can't we do it for exercise-induced muscle damage, whereby this may decrease performance for an athlete? And this was the kind of hypothetical model and the mechanisms that they put in the medical hypothesis, but to actually test the system, they pretty much ran a study at the same time as publishing it. So what did they do? They used the between groups design. One group received 3 × 5 cycles of IPC, which is a standardized dose at 220 millimeters of mercury, and the other was a control trial before the performance of an eccentric exercise task. You can see the IPC condition in black and the control in white. And there was big reductions in pain again, which is maybe what was observed in the clinical literature, which was great for them. So this classic delayed onset of muscle soreness window, which I'm sure many of us have experienced. A few in this room have actually participated in one of my studies. It's not very nice. So this was a great buy-in for the population that they used. Also, through electrically invoked stimulations, they found a maintenance of muscle function during this renowned period for a reduction that would normally occur. On a more molecular level, they monitored creatine kinase, and this is obviously one of the key damage markers associated with muscle damage, and they showed that IPC pretty much completely nullified this creatine kinase spike after muscle damage was performed. So some data from our lab and from my PhD would kind of maybe support this as well. This is currently unpublished, but we kind of showed that on a plasma cytokine measure, we were looking at IL-6 and IL-1RA, so we kind of found a reduction in pro-inflammatory activity. And also on a heat shock protein level, we found a maintenance of heat shock protein 32 throughout the muscle damage window, which may be an indicator of better handling of oxidative stress. Also, HSP27 was spiked, and we know that intracellular HSP27 has big implications for the protective nature against muscle damage. So to conclude this section before we move on to performance, I think that based on what we know, based on what we've seen, it's about trying to get the small wins. And if you've got patients that do suffer or are completely immobile but have no vascular or neurological complications, we can maybe use IPC as a bit of a mimetic stimulus to actually at least get some vascular maintenance or adaptation in function. My PhD specifically probably focused on more of this type of stuff. So today I'm actually going to just discuss quickly some mechanisms and some insights into the protocol surrounding how we'd use IPC for an athlete to maybe get the best out of them. There's a range of factors, and I'll go through these one by one. And luckily, we're in a situation now where there's a few reviews on the topic come out, so our understanding of how IPC may be effective or not is starting to increase alongside with some of the performance and mechanistic data. So we'll start with cuff pressure. One of the authors is in this room, but this was a really nice paper. One of the first ones I actually read when I started my PhD journey. And this was kind of like an understated paper, and it doesn't get cited probably as much as it should, because a lot of the time when we submit papers for review, when we use pressures of 220 millimeters of mercury, we always get questioned, oh, why didn't you actually use pulsatile flow? They actually showed that either on the upper limbs or lower limbs, complete arterial blockade, which is probably the key criteria for using ischemic preconditioning, was present only at 180 millimeters of mercury. So as I said, if the standard pressure is 220 in most populations with similar sized athletes, we know that limb size can affect it, but these guys use a quite reasonable recreational demographic. This shouldn't be an issue. So the highest recorded pressure in the literature at the minute on exercise stands around 300 millimeters of mercury. And at 180, we know that some of the key mechanisms associated with maybe the preconditioning in an exercise sense were all present. This includes partial pressures of carbon dioxide, saturation of oxygen, even changes in lactate, which itself is preconditioning by nature. They did show an increased pain response. So when I go back to this group that used 300, you may think, oh, that might be actually a little bit out of order or too high, unnecessarily high. But the levels of pain received from 180 millimeters of mercury were really no different to that in our lab when we've been using 220. And I think that's probably because after you fully occlude the artery, the pain sensation is probably capped or blunted. Certainly anecdotally, that's been reported for us. So moving on to the type of exercise. This is a bit of a funny one, so I've just kind of kept it basic. Okay, so most of the literature to date has assessed either running, cycling, or swimming, because they're easy to monitor and quite easy to control in a lab. When we look at review papers, there's not really been anything to suggest that there is a suited modality for use of IPC. So I quickly ran some numbers based on the kind of studies that I had listed in a database. And what came out was actually quite interesting. So for cycling, it seems to be around a 50% response rate in terms of significant findings in the literature. Running, it actually is only 25%. And for swimming, it's pretty much the inverse. So there's quite a high percentage rate of significant findings in swimmers. The only other thing to add onto this chart is the actual number of investigations. So cycling's probably received the most attention to date, running second and then swimming third. But nevertheless, there certainly seems to be something going on first inspection. So I've just listed the 7 tests that have been performed in swimmers to try and give us a little bit of insight and to determine whether there's anything going on. So what we know, looking on initial inspection, is there actually isn't anything different to any other literature. There's been a few kind of proposals and hypotheses regarding the intensity. So you can see that every single effective swimming study, predominantly anaerobic glycolytic energy systems were in place. And we know that, you know, with this greater metabolic rate and the lower mitochondrial density in these fibers, it's thought that these fibers may undergo faster substrate exhaustion upon ischemia. So they might actually be quite a good target for ischemic preconditioning, whereby great stress is placed on those fibers. Also on this note, we know that IPC leads to an opening of the mitochondrial ATP potassium channel. This has implications for oxidative phosphorylation, but interestingly, it was proposed by the top authors that you can see, the 100-meter time trial performance, it was improved, that they thought that it was due to a faster uptake of acetyl coenzyme A, which is a byproduct of using glycolysis as an energy system, that was responsible for their findings that people improved, but lactate was the same. This is still just a hypothesis, as with many things in this field, but certainly the data is there to suggest that something may be going on in this population. I think if we move away from just trying to put things out there and using hypotheses, what we do know is that between swimming, cycling and running, swimming is probably the most different, probably mainly because of the entrained nature of breathing. So there's quite marked reductions in O2 saturations, normally between 80 and 85% PaO2, which is what you'd find at severe altitude. So what I did was I basically just went through the literature quickly and assessed what studies had been done at altitude and what the findings were to see if actually this was something that we could maybe take forward to investigate. And it actually apparently seems that there is something in this. So this study was done by Gary Foster's group, and they showed that 5 days of repeated preconditioning, so daily IPC bouts, were able to significantly improve 12.8 kilometre time trial running at high altitude. This was 4,300 metres, so very high altitude. But alongside this, they actually managed to get some mechanistic data with it. So they showed improvements in oxygen saturation and reductions in systolic pressure and artery pressures alongside that. Another recent study, again, showed that time trial performance is more likely to be improved the higher up you go. So they found moderate kind of increases in performance at 1,200 meters, which is pretty low. But as you start to get to moderate altitude of 2,400 meters, that magnitude of increase or performance increase actually increases. And the author stated that the maintenance of oxygen saturation, the same mechanism of the previous paper, may have been responsible for this, because they also found that. So moving away from mode, a lot of the literature or the review papers, they tend to pull things in duration, shortest event to longest event. So what have they kind of found? In terms of duration, the overall message from a couple of systematic reviews and meta-analysis is that IPC has a small effect on exercise performance. However, the greatest effect tends to be in aerobic or predominantly aerobic sports versus anaerobic tasks. So moving on to my first PhD study here, we use this kind of rationale to test the first kind of problem with a protocol, which is the amount of ischemic cycles that is actually needed to induce a performance improvement if there is going to be one. And we did this in two ways, really. The first was to investigate the amount of cycles, and the second was to investigate the response of a dose tissue response. So the way we manipulated dose firstly is we doubled the traditional dose, which is 4 times 5 minute occlusions, to an 8 times 5 minute occlusion. So people were sat on the bed for an hour and 20 minutes before they started. Secondly, we wanted to assess whether occluding 2 limbs was more effective or less effective than occluding 1 limb. Again, do we need a tissue threshold, or are we okay with less? So moving on to the study results, we found that the most likely increase in performance was down to the traditional 4 times 5 minute protocol. 1.4% quicker overall, which was actually determined in unclear inference based on our typical error of our study. But I think that the main emphasis of this is you don't need additional cycles. 4 times 5 minutes is more than enough to get an effect, if there is going to be one. And also, occluding bilaterally seems to be more effective than just 1 limb, as we found an 18-second improvement between those conditions. So what about the cuff location? We've talked about remote and local ischemic preconditioning clinically and the effect that the transfer of a remote humeral factor can have. In terms of performance, we found absolutely no difference between occluding on the arms or the legs in a cycling performance task. What does this mean? Whether it's a humerally remote mechanism that's causing it, it doesn't really make a difference. So if you're strapped for time or it's inconvenient, you can probably whack cuffs on the upper limbs if they're easier to access for an athlete. And we kind of drew up this little mechanistic insight or performance applied insight where we basically tried to document it clearly to date what the literature is showing. So we'd probably say 2 limbs are more effective than 1 based on the data we've collected. The 4 times 5 classic ischemic stimulus seems to be fine. In terms of a location, you can use either or. However, applying locally on a tissue may induce a greater vascular vasodilatory effect. This may not carry through to performance, however. In terms of exercise intensity, I've discussed modality a little bit, but the overall literature would suggest more aerobic performance is a greater target, and we've seen the muscle damage implications from the earlier slides, which I think is a great area of interest that is needed to go forward. So we've talked about the protocol and how we can optimally apply ischemic preconditioning to a limb. How quickly or what time duration before the event should this be done, though? And there's kind of 3 real windows. We use acute IPC, which is applying ischemic preconditioning within 4 hours of the event. We use a delayed IPC, which is using 12 to 72 hour window, which fits the muscle damage stuff quite well. Or there's a repeated IPC, which I showed you the altitude study and some of the vascular work, which is consecutive days of ischemic preconditioning doses. So let's focus on the acute IPC studies for a second. So how quickly before an exercise competition do we need to use this if we're going to use it? And the systematic review data would basically say there's a pretty weak correlation. Whenever you're doing aerobic exercise, it doesn't seem to matter whether you do it 5 minutes before, an hour before. It doesn't really seem to make a difference. However, they did show a moderate correlation with anaerobic activity, stating that leaving it at least 40 to 50 minutes before you actually compete may be beneficial for a predominantly anaerobic exercise. This was a swimming study, one of the ones that I've listed on the swimming slide. And this kind of breaks the model a little bit because, as I said, those three kind of categories of preconditioning windows were based on the clinical literature that show tissue protection. What they found was the most effective timing was 8 hours before the swim competition. So this is actually in no man's land in terms of clinical protection, because the IPC protection is a biphasic response. We get an acute protection, a kind of a nullified period, and then about 12 hours in, we kick in for a delayed protection response. So this was some really interesting data, and they actually showed that 1 hour before a swim competition or a 50-meter time trial was the weakest, and it wasn't really that effective at all. So moving on to the last part of the equation, the repeated bouts. Regular bouts of IPC, 5 to 7 days, which normally actually coincides with a taper period for an athlete. So if you're actually looking at a practical perspective, I think this could be probably the one that's the way forward, because you don't have to inconvenience athletes near a start line or when they've got other things to do. And what they showed was that after 7 days, this is quite a new study just out in September, there was a big increase in cycling efficiency following 7 days of IPC versus a control. This was actually nicely married up with increases in time to exhaustion and greater power output and maximal aerobic incremental test. So I was recently chatting to a coach and a sports scientist working for an elite team, and they were kind of asking me where the literature or the research needs to go, and I probably said for you guys, probably this one, because again, the athlete can do it at home. It doesn't really inconvenience the daily preparation cycles, and it seems to maybe carry something, but a lot more work's needed on this. So overall, we've discussed some mechanisms, we've discussed some kind of practical applications, both in a clinical and practical setting, but I suppose the key question is how much impact does this have on a competition day? And when we actually think about all of the things athletes are already doing at the elite level, or they should be doing, the effect that IPC has in the lab, where everything is controlled, to the start line is probably nullified or greatly reduced. There's certainly, most athletes nowadays are taking caffeine, which we know is an adenosine antagonist, so vasodilatory responses are probably blunted, and caffeine itself gives us about a 3% performance increase, I think, on average. So that is probably a greater stimulus in itself than IPC is. When we think about optimal warm-ups, we look at the literature. A lot of the performance testing is carried out without a sufficient warm-up, so maybe the IPC is acting as a bit of a, as I said, an exercise mimetic. We've got data currently in review suggesting that if you do actually take your time and really physically prep the athlete, that effect that IPC has may kind of carry less weight. And obviously, I think the biggest killer of performance or additive to performance is probably how recovered or well rested your athlete is at the bottom. So if your athlete's rested or they're not well rested, it doesn't really matter what we do, because we're not going to make up that gap. And I think lastly but not least, the recent media on the old Kipchoge marathon, inspirational, but we can't obviously ignore the technological advances that are starting to crop up. So when we marry up these things, at the minute, I just don't think the literature is there to suggest this is worthwhile on race day. However, as some of the things I've discussed in terms of a lead-in period, using it as a bit of a taper or an exercise mimetic, I think there could be something in that. So that is all from me. Thank you for your attention and any questions.